So we're in the final section of what I would say is not just Avimelech, but also Gidon. They're connected. You remember that Gidon was privileged to have a lot of communication from God, from an angel, lots of signs, and was asked to be a king and refused the kingship, the monarchy, and his son, an unlikely son with a concubine, decided to take the monarchy for himself and reigned for, I think it turns out to be 3 years. We're in the final scene right now. And so I don't know if we can talk about Avimelech separate from Gidon. To me, it feels like it needs to be a joint package. And we'll look at a few of those, a few reasons why I think that today. But let's go ahead and do this final chapter in Avimelech's life. So Harold, if you would do us the honor of reading the first verse, and then the first verses, and then we'll go on from there. Go ahead.
When all the citizens of the Tower of Shechem learned of this, they went into the tunnel of the temple of El Berit.
Okay, learned of this was the ambushing of the others in the field, the other Shechemites in the field. So he's already gone at it. We'll remember last week was Gal and Gal ben Evid, who had challenged Avimelech's authority, and Zvul, Avimelech's buddy. And so we find out that not all the Shechemites were murdered or were killed. There's still some, and they went into a tunnel. The word here for tunnel is tsariach. A modern usage of the word tsariach is the turret of a tank. I was the gunner of a tank. And it's sometimes used in other kinds of kind of a chamber of sorts. Yes, Ella?
What?
Ella, did you want to say something?
No, what is bariach then?
No, a bariach has to do with locking something which is locked.
Oh, okay.
All right, so tsariach, people would refer to the turret. The turret of a tank is the part that turns around. You know, there's the body of the tank, the battle tank, and the part that turns around that has the cannon and the machine guns on it. But here we don't know what it means exactly. Some people suggest that it's an underground part of a temple. Some people suggest that it's an upper part of the temple, and we simply don't know, and none of the commentators really have any proof one way or another. So, but we do know it's a chamber where people seem to feel safe and relatively large, in this case at least. Okay, go ahead, Harold.
When Avimelech was informed that all the citizens of the Tower of Shechem had gathered there, Avimelech and all the troops he had with him went up on Mount Zalmon. Taking an axe in his hand, Avimelech lopped off a tree limb and lifted it onto his shoulder. Then he said to the troops that accompanied him, "What you saw me do, quick, do the same."
Okay, so there's a tactic, and remember, all these stories have had all sorts of let's say guerrilla tactics, non-normative tactics, and we're learning about a new way to fight a siege, or to move along a battle a new way. We don't know yet what's going to happen. We can imagine already. There's a few difficulties with the words here. So chatetzim, the bough of branches, the branches. Some people, the Greek translation here, we have two major traditions in the translation, the Septuagint translation. One of them has brushwood, and the other one has what is it? Brushwood and branches. One has branches, one has brushwood. Somebody else thinks it might be thorns, but then the argument against whether it's thorns is that where did he carry it? He chopped them off and he carried it on his shoulder. I'm not so sure we have to look at the details of the realia here, especially since it seems to me that there's a play on words between Shechem, the name of the city, and shichmo, his shoulder, right? It comes from the same word, and I think that the wordplay was more important to the narrator than the details. It would fit very well if these were to be thorns. Perhaps you can guess already why I'm going to say that, but we'll wait until the end. We'll wait a little bit more, and we'll go back to the thorns burning. One way or another, this is what he does, and then he says, the same way that I'm doing it, you do too. That sound familiar to anybody? So Harold, look at the. Go ahead and read the next verse. This is from a few chapters ago.
Watch me, he said, and do the same. When I get to the outposts of the camp, do exactly as I do.
Remember, that was Gidon with the pots and the torches. Also torches and fires involved, and you monkey see, monkey do kind of a thing. It's a way of teaching, leading by example. So there are a number of things in this chapter that link to everything that came beforehand, which is why I said that I think that we should probably talk about the Gidon or the Gideon Avimelech section of the book of Judges and not necessarily isolate them. One more challenge here is the word for axes. Usually in later Judaism, we understand that to be a little bit more of a shovel kind of a thing, I think. But still, and it could be that it's a word from another language as well, and not originally Hebrew or Semitic. Okay, so this is the first section, and watch me and see what I'm going to do. So why don't we go on, if you'd like to, Michael, if you'd like to read the next section. We're in verse 49.
So each of the troops also lopped off a bough. Then they marched behind Abimelech and laid them against the tunnel and set fire to the tunnel over their heads. Thus all the people of the Tower of Shechem also perished, about 1,000 men and women.
So first of all, we see by the end that it was a large space, 1,000 men and women, assuming there's any kind of relation to reality here. It's hard to say where were they exactly? Were they at the base of this temple, and the people were in the tunnel below, but they were still below them? They lit the fire under them, lit the fire on top of them, opposite them. All those things are possible in the Hebrew. We just don't know because we don't have anything in archaeology that we can hold on to and say, oh, this is what it must be talking about. But we get the gist of it. The gist of it is that they use fire to either asphyxiate or to perhaps burn in some way. If you use enough fire against a stone structure, the stones will crack and burst, and the place will fall down. That's the lessons that were learned in the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So you've got all that going on, but this also relates to something we read beforehand in this section of Judges of Gidon and Avimelech, and that is from the parable of Yotam. If you could go ahead again, another verse, Michael.
And the thorn bush said to the trees, if you are acting honorably in anointing me king over you, come and take shelter in my shade. But if not, may fire issue from the thorn bush and consume the cedars of Lebanon.
Okay, so we remember that, right? If you were with us, it was, I think 2 weeks ago we did this. And it feels like that this is a fulfillment of the quote prophecy. We'll just call it for a second, the prophecy of Yotam in his fable or his parable. This is what's going to happen in the end. You go with this guy. If you place the thorn bush above you as a king, you're going to get burned, literally burned. And so this is playing out, and it feels like this is how the narrative has been structured. Again, why I talk about this whole thing from Gidon all the way through to through Yotam, through Avimelech. And also in the world of Gidon, there was a lot of plant life. Remember, there were things a lot to do with agriculture and plants. This brings it in. The antithesis, perhaps, of the plants in the field of wheat and olives and grapes that were in the parable, of course, is the thorn, which is in at least in the eyes of the farmer, is good for nothing. Not only good for nothing, but destructive kind of a thing. And there's one more kind of a link, an inner, a linguistic or a keyword kind of a link here. And that was in the parable, they said, if you're going to be in the shade of the thorn bush, which of course is a little bit ridiculous. We don't think of thorns providing so much shade, but thorn, where was all this happening? Where did Avimelech come from in the first section? Anybody notice the geographical location? Even though we may not be able to put our finger on a map, what was the place called? Anybody notice?
No.
He went up on Mount
On a
Salmon.
mountain.
Salmon.
Mount Salmon, Salmon from Tselim, from shade, the woody, the shady mountain. And so these things are all connected, I believe, in the way that the narrator has crafted this story. To show that everything is being tied up. It's a neat bundle that's being tied up. So the Shechemites have gotten their own. They have been burnt to a crisp, or they've been suffocated through this fire. The parable has the mashal has been nimshald. It's played out in real life. The prophecy has been fulfilled, and but we're still not done. Now remember, Avimelech, it wasn't like he was king over the whole land, right? He was king over Shechem and maybe some of the other cities around there. It wasn't a widespread thing, but in his anger and in his hubris, he's going out against his enemies and ambushing them and then burning them. And it feels like there's just one more town that he's got to destroy. And that's what's coming up in the next section. Would anybody like to say anything before? I haven't really, but if you have any questions or statements until now. Sure.
Nothing connected. I just feel it's really difficult for me to see this scene in front of me, like people being, how do you call it, that they're being choked to death. It actually reminded me of something when I was young in a summer camp in England, and we went to York. And there was a scene there where the Jewish people of the town were actually also suffocated, I think, in this mivtzar, right? In this
Fortress.
Fortress. And after that, actually, the Tower of York, and afterwards the Jews there put a ban on the city, and Jews were not there for about 300 years at least.
I don't know.
Yeah, for many, I think not so long ago, actually, that ban. Maybe somebody knows that story.
I know something about the story. I don't think they were burned. It was the Jews of York. This was sometime in the 12th century. It was sometime in the 1100s. And they ran up into this tower. And I mean, it was almost like a Masada kind of thing. They ran up into this tower, and it was a question of either they convert to Christianity or they die. And I think what happened is they took their own lives.
They did?
I think they took that. I think I'll have to look it up again. I may be wrong, but I think they took their own lives. Rather,
I may have remembered it wrong. I remembered that they were burned in there.
Okay. Yeah.
But it kind of just brought back that memory to me. So I find it very difficult to read these things.
Yeah, I was thinking of exactly the same thing as we were reading this, the people going up into a tower and being, burned or killed, destroyed somehow. Yeah.
Right. So we remember in our own Jewish memories these things. Of course, they happened all around the world. People thought they were finding refuge, only to find their death in that place of refuge. And this is rough stuff, right? Because this is not, again, we have this debate among scholars whether these stories echo Shechem as a non-Israelite enclave, like a Canaanite, a bastion of Canaanitism, even after the Israeli conquest, or is it a purely Israelite town? And it seems to me that it is indeed an Israelite town. I would go with those scholars. That's how I've been swayed. And so these are us. This is us doing This is us doing it to ourselves, which is a painful part of the Book of Judges. And we're going to have some other. Yeah, we'll have more about us doing it to ourselves.
Yes,
Okay.
it happened on March 16th, 1190. A wave of anti-Semitic riots culminated in the massacre of an estimated 150 Jews, the entire population, the entire Jewish community of York, who had taken shelter in the tower.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, they took shelter in there, and just look up. There's more. There's a whole page on it.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ella.
Okay. Anything else before we go on to the next section? Okay. John, would you like to read 50, 52, or the next series of verses? Let's take them one at a time.
Remember to turn my mic off this time. Or on. Abimelech proceeded to Thebes. He encamped at Thebes and occupied it. Within the town was a fortified tower, and all the citizens of the town, men and women, took refuge there. They shut themselves in and went up on the roof of the tower. Abimelech pressed forward to the tower and attacked it. He approached the door of the tower to set it on fire.
Okay, so again, we don't know where Tevitz is. Interesting enough, well, I think we'll see at the end, Josephus calls it Thebes. Some people, scholars have suggested perhaps it's what is Tubas today, if you know the road going up to in the Jordan River Valley on the way to Beit Shan, and you pass the opposite where Shechem, Nablus Shechem is on left hand. You go up, there is a town there called Tubas. Perhaps it's similar, I don't know. Guess it matters. I think it's probably 15, 20 miles from Shechem. It's possible, but it looks like the same thing is about to happen. And again, the narrator builds up that tension by saying it's the same thing. They're also the people there, they're in a tower, and he's got his fire. He knows what he wants to do now. He's got his modus operandi of burning people to get them out. And again, it's not to say he invented this. I'm sure it was done in other places, other parts, but this is a particular feature of this narrative of Avimelech. But of course, now the story takes a turn. Go ahead, John.
But a woman dropped an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and cracked his skull. He immediately cried out to his attendant, his arms bearer, "Draw your dagger and finish me off, that they may not say to me, a woman killed him." So his attendant stabbed him and he died.
That's
God forbid he dies at the hands of a woman, right? Did you want to say something?
yeah, but it's kind of strange. The milestone is not dropped where he could see the woman. It's dropped from, it has to be dropped from a higher place. How does he know that it's a woman?
Good. There are commentators who ask that exact question. The best, I mean, it's what's his name? Blanking on his name. It's the latest Anchor Bible. It's the latest of the. He says because a millstone was used by women, right? A millstone is the top. It's not the millstone itself. To grind the wheat, to make flour. There's a bottom stone which is bigger, and there's a top stone which is smaller and can be handled by a woman. And so there's all sorts of examples of those kinds of stones throughout the ancient Near East. And so what he claims in his commentary is that only women use this. Men don't do this. So therefore he knew it would be a woman. But of course, Ella, I think the real answer to Ella is that this is the narrator, right? This narrator's structured a story, and he has a reason for saying this. Anybody, does this remind anybody of anything?
This is somebody, a woman that took like a tent stake and pounded into somebody's head.
Exactly, Yael, exactly. And it was the same thing going on there. Just but one more before we go on, we turn the page. This millstone, the unsaid words here are Avimelech finds his death, yes, at the hands of a woman, but also the hands of his servant, of his arms bearer, but by a single stone. By a single stone. And do you remember how Avimelech put his brothers to death?
No.
Killed all 70 of them on a
stone.
single stone. And so it could be as well, there's an intentional link here between those parts of the story. So why don't we turn the page, Sid, if you could read from the section that you referred to from Judges 4, 8-9.
But Barak said to her, if you will go with me, I will go. If not, I will not go. Very well, I will go with you, she answered. However, there will be no glory for you in the course you are taking, for then the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. So Deborah went to Barak to Kadesh.
And of course, that indeed is what happened, that Sisera died at the hands of Yael, as you remembered beforehand. But it's kind of this passage, oh my, anything but, I'm happy to die, but just not at the hands of a woman, right?
Right. It's just like, I mean, it just seems like the narrator is not only killing them, but killing them with women, which is like taking down their might, so to speak.
Yeah, it's kind of castration after death.
Yes.
Okay,
Good.
all right, we get you. Okay, and there's lots of parallels in world culture. This is nothing. I think just specific to biblical culture. So that's one aspect of this. In other words, if you're going to die on the battlefield, you should die the right way. You see this a lot in Star Trek with Worf, right? With Lieutenant Worf, who was a Klingon. There's a lot about which of the ways that are respectful, that he should die. What is an honorable death? And Klingons, they have courage to face any honorable death. It's the dishonorable death that they're worried about. Well, we have another case of a possible dishonorable death, and that's in Samuel. Go ahead, Sid, read the next section from the story of Saul. So the end of Saul, King Saul, Shaul, as they fight the
From
Philistines.
Samuel. The Philistines pursued Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, son of Saul. The battle raged around Saul, and some of the archers hit him, and he was severely wounded by the archers. Saul said to his arms bearer, draw your sword and run me through, so that the uncircumcised may not run me through and make sport of me. But his arms bearer in his great awe refused, whereupon Saul grasped the sword and fell upon it. When his arms bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him.
A lot of heroic deaths here, right? God forbid that the uncircumcised is the one. Here, it's not exactly the one who kill me, but they'll torture me, I think, is the fear here. But I see, it sounds like some similarities here. And that raises another issue of something we'll talk about in just a moment, but I'll already raise it now, is that remember, Gideon was asked to be king, and he said, and he had tried passing the leadership over to his younger son. Remember, he gave him the sword, and the son, couldn't do it. And it was pointed out at the time that's a man's work, right? You can't give it to a kid. And in general, Gideon says, no, this is not about royalty. This is not going to happen. Of course, ironically, his son, whose name means my father is king, Avimelech, becomes the king, or takes the kingship to himself. And it's a lesson in the troubles of having a monarch. If anything, it's a lesson not to have a king. And it seems like Saul is the same kind of a lesson. Of course, in the hands of the editors of these books, it's not so much that you shouldn't have a king, but it's you need to have the right king. And that's why it's often pointed out that the people who edited these books, they were very much in favor of the Davidic line of kings and not the other ones, that went the usurpers, the various usurpers from other tribes, or even from not the correct tribe. And if we were to do the book of Kings, we would see that as well. Okay. Any comments or questions?
Yeah, I have a question. It's just a broad question. How many kings of Israel and Judah were there altogether? If there was quite a few, I understand we don't really know about.
There's this, I don't know the number, I don't know, 15, 20 or something like that. I don't remember the number. But they're all listed in the book of Kings and in Chronicles, and it's kind of a parallel between the Northern Kingdom and the Judean Kingdom as well. But I don't have the answer to that question. So.
I was just curious.
But a lot.
Rabbi?
Yes.
So, one of the lessons here is be careful where you decide to hide. Don't hide in a tower where it's really hard, there's no exit. Because this is really a story about, people hiding in towers that end up getting burned down, although it's also possible by hiding in a tower, you can drop a millstone on your enemy. So is there any commentary on questions about towers and hiding and the risks of hiding in places that can be burned?
So remember, perhaps from last week, that where were they killed and ambushed? In the field. I think what the narrator wants to say in all this is there's really nowhere to hide on one hand, and also there's no protection, because you can even be killed by, as you said, by a millstone being dropped from a head, from a woman. This story is related to, does anybody know, John, do you know where this actually story is quoted later on in the Hebrew Bible? Anybody know? Sister Claire, look like perhaps you knew, no? So do you remember the story? Who was our quintessential heroic king? David, right?
David, yeah.
David. And how did David almost lose his throne?
Well, Abishai rebelled.
But what was kind of the beginning of David's downfall? Story of him and Bathsheba.
Oh, that's what I was thinking, but I didn't.
And in that story, he sends to Yoav, he sends Uriah, the husband, the lawful husband of the one he slept with and impregnated. He wants to knock him off, and says to Uriah, he sends a letter with Uriah himself to Yoav, the commander of the troops in the field in the war. Put him close to the heat of the battle so that he will be killed. And Yoav sends back to him, I think, I don't remember who says who to what, but this story is mentioned there. Be careful, because don't forget about Avimelech, whose downfall was a woman who killed him. And there's kind of a spirit of prophecy in those words to David as well. It's a woman who will bring about his downfall. So I think, Michael, that in the end, none of this was meant to be relevant history for military commanders as to where to go. I think whereas other literature could be. I don't think our Hebrew biblical literature is about the lessons of war, where to best attack and where not. By the way, in Ezekiel, there's a whole thing about this. He makes a working model of a city under siege. In general, Ezekiel does stuff. He performs things in order to play out his prophecies. So you do have these different passages that have a lot to do with ancient warfare, but they're always in the service of promoting a different message. And here the message is, no matter how hot you think how hot stuff you are, that is, if you bring, you burn people, you can get killed by the most insignificant, that is the woman. That's not me speaking, that's the text itself. And perhaps also a lesson here is no matter what, if you raise above yourself a bad leader, no matter where you go, there'll be no place to hide. You'll be safe nowhere. So to me, those are the underlying lessons and morals, as opposed to, the actual advice as to how to do a war. Anybody else? Yes. Bill?
Yes, on this millstone for the woman, this woman was schlepping the millstone clear up to the top. Where did they grind the grain or the corn at? Was it in the lower part of the tower?
So this is not the kind of millstone that has an ox or a bunch of men
No,
pushing
it was a hand one.
a hand
she-
one. So it could have been
Yeah.
this big.
Yeah, so she's carrying that around with her?
Well, she could have been, they need to eat their food wherever they're holed up. We don't know how long they were up there with. It's like it's a kitchen utensil. It just happens to be a particularly heavy one that can do damage. So in the same way that they had cooking utensils, they had this. In other words, I don't think that the grinding of grain, perhaps this will answer your question, was not something that was done in an industrial fashion or in a communal fashion. It was done in a familial setting.
Mhm.
Okay,
And
so
it's just right in order to kill someone.
right.
Well, to crack his skull.
Yeah.
Well, think of it as a pressure cooker, right? Remember those pressure cookers with the really heavy metal? You drop one of those things from a few dozen feet above, that'll probably also kill you.
Yeah. Right.
And then, of course, there's some people that their baking skills are such that if you drop a loaf of bread that they've made from that height.
Could also kill you.
Okay,
Okay.
Not one.
all right. Harold, did you want to say something?
Oh, I just had this is a very quick question. This battle that Saul lost to the Philistines, is that the battle that supposedly took place in the vicinity of Mount Gilboa?
Yes, yeah. And one of his sons, Malkishua, there's a kibbutz Malkishua that's on the side of the mountain there.
Okay.
Yeah. Beautiful part of Israel, of course. Okay. All right. So why don't we read the end of this story? Jackie, you want to read the end of our epic here, our epic tale?
'55, '57.
Okay. Where are we at? I'm sorry.
We're at 55 to 57, the middle of the page, second page.
When the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead, everyone went home. Thus God repaid Abimelech for the evil he had done to his father by slaying his 70 brothers. And God likewise repaid the men of Shem for all their wickedness. And so the curse of Jotham, son of Jerubbaal, was fulfilled upon them.
Okay. And the commentators all point out here, who was left. And this is an editorial comment by someone who wanted to put this story in the context of all the people of Israel. Even though it's a very local tale, we've seen all the stories we've had have been local, some a few tribes, some just one tribe. In this case, it's not even a whole tribe. It seems like one particular area around Shechem, but then the editor says, well, this is a lesson for all of Israel. Once they saw this, they all went home. If you pay attention to the details of the story, it doesn't feel like there's too many people to go home, like they're all dead. In some ways, maybe an echo of the salting of the fields, sowing salt in the fields, this kind of destruction, ultimate destruction. It feels like Avimelech is a rather unhappy person. And so those that trusted in him, they came to an unhappy end as well. And the narrator ties it all up into a neat bundle about the man who said no to the monarchy and whose son said yes, and in the process killed all of his brothers and was brutal, Then he died, and so did those that went after him. Comments or questions?
So only the Israelis were left to go home.
Say it again.
Only the men of Israel were left. They were the only ones left.
It's everybody is an Israelite there. It's kind of this last comment doesn't really mesh with the details of the story. That's my point, because they're all Israelites.
I'm comparing Gideon with Avimelech and thinking Gideon, who would probably have made a really good king, compared to his son Avimelech, who was terrible. And it seems like you have to choose good people to be your ruler, not evil people. It seems like it goes on in our own time too. It's not always good people who rule.
Anyone else? Okay, then. Trudy, you want to read from Josephus? So before we do Josephus, who kind of sums up this chapter or this part of the book of Judges, and he adds his own editorial comments because I think he feels something is missing in the narrative. What I wanted to do today, remember last week I said we're going back to a little bit of Talmudic study, and I brought different passages of Talmud. One of my meta goals of today, other than to finish the story, was to talk about the intertextuality of the book of Judges, or in general these books, these historiographical books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And we could have done more of that, but to go back and forth to show how stories often have semantic or linguistic characteristics of themselves which keep them together as a package, and that's what connected the Gidon stories to the Avimelech stories. But sometimes it's in the wider context, that this case, say the book of Judges, the disgrace over having somebody say a woman won the war, or you lost the war to a woman, your life to a woman, those kind of things, or a death in the right way, and how all this is what I would say today are good examples of inner biblical midrash, as opposed to last week, which was Talmudic midrash. A few times ago, I brought the Sefer Yerachmiel, of the medieval book, which was medieval midrash. These are different aspects of commentary on the Hebrew Bible, and all of them, whether it's inside of the text itself, inside of the same chapter of any biblical book, there's inner biblical interpretation, because, and all the more so with the distance of 1,000 years or 2,000 years, all this has to do with keeping the text sacred / relevant. It won't be sacred if it doesn't continue to have relevance. And for it to have relevance, it needs to be read and reread, interpreted and reinterpreted. Okay, so let's take an example of a relatively early interpretation, a good example of what we call biblical paraphrase, taking the biblical story but paraphrasing it in a way that makes it more understandable to your own public, your readership. In this case, it's Josephus, second half of the first century of the Common Era in Rome, writing in Koine Greek, that is the simple person's Greek, not Homeric Greek, but the simple Greek, writing for the masses, explaining, or the apologetic of the Jewish people. So go ahead, Trudy, if you will.
Now, Abimelech, when he had affrighted the Israelites with the miseries he had brought upon the Shechemites, seemed openly to affect greater authority than he now had, and appeared to set no bounds to his violence, unless it were with the destruction of all. Accordingly, he marched to Thebes and took the city on the sudden, and there, being a great tower therein, whereunto the whole multitude fled, he made preparation to besiege it. Now, as he was rushing with violence near the gates, a woman threw a piece of millstone upon his head, upon which Abimelech fell down, and desired his armor bearer to kill him, lest his death should be thought to be the work of a woman, who did what he was bid to do. So he underwent this death as a punishment for the wickedness he had perpetrated against his brethren, and his insolent barbarity to the Shechemites. Now the calamity that happened to those Shechemites was according to the prediction of Jotham. However, the army that was with Abimelech upon his fall was scattered abroad and went to their own homes.
So if we were to pick apart each of these sentences, I think you would find that Josephus is smoothing over the discrepancies in the account, in the biblical account, making it simpler, making it in one direction. For instance, he doesn't have the story of the first tower of the burning. Perhaps that was his way of editing out something particularly nefarious. Josephus is famous or infamous, depending on where you're standing, for leaving out embarrassing stories about our ancestors, like the David and Bathsheba story, like Judah and Tamar. He leaves out things that make us look bad, and perhaps an Israelite burning 1,000 other Israelites looks too bad, and yet he'll even out the fact that, well, who were the Israelites who scattered? They were his own army. They were Israelites, and they went back. What he's trying to do is to build a better, what is the expression? Build a better car, a better, is there some expression?
Mousetrap.
Build a better what?
Mousetrap.
Mousetrap. He wants to build a better mousetrap, right? He wants to build a better story that has more inner consistencies, I think, whatever. And again, a wonderful example of midrash, of interpretation that tells the story in a way that will be more meaningful, at least in the eyes of the storyteller, in this case, Josephus, to his public, his reading public. Comments or questions? Yes, Rita Claire.
I have a problem with all of this. I don't understand. So there's Israelites killing Israelites. They're killing their own. I don't understand that.
Really? You've never seen that happen in the world?
That's what
Yes,
war is all about.
that doesn't mean that I have to understand it.
Okay. So maybe we can rephrase and say you're rather uncomfortable with this.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
The understanding that the biblical author wants us to have is that hubris brought about and narcissism and perhaps just plain old evil bring about a situation in which brother kills brother. Remember how he got to the job? He got to the job by killing his brothers.
Yeah.
And you'll also remember that our sacred literature begins more or less, in the 3rd chapter of the book of Genesis with brother killing brother. It's a realization there's something rather nasty in the human condition. And these stories, I think, are meant to bring us to realize, to look at ourselves and to see, so in what ways are we Avimelech? In what ways are we the Israelites? And that's uncomfortable.
It's very uncomfortable, so therefore we haven't really learned anything. We're supposed to have learned from studying all this, and really, have we learned anything?
Well, you have learned something. I don't think you've killed any of your own people lately, right? Well, there's one thing, right?
Maybe some of my, but not my kids.
Nobody in Or Hamidbar has killed anybody else in Or Hamidbar. Let's take it one step at a time. I think we're doing all right, Anybody else?
Yeah, I have a comment.
Please. Diane,
Can you hear me?
yes.
Well, I was shocked that Josephus, or I forget how you pronounce his name, but that he would sort of change scripture, to sound better, to clean up the act or something.
Well, do you know the story of Jethro, Moses's father-in-law? Does that mean anything to you?
No,
So we're in the
go back and
chapter.
look at it.
So it's in Exodus 18. We're in the chapters right before the giving of the law at Sinai, and Moses's father-in-law, who was a priest of Midian, he was another religious clergy person, right? He was a leader. He comes to the camp and he sees Moses. First of all, he's allowed to offer a sacrifice. That in itself, he's a non-Israelite. He's offering a sacrifice. But you could say, okay, it's before the giving of the Torah, the way it appears in our book. And he offers Moses the advice that if he continues to judge all by himself the people, he'll kill himself. He'll be overrun. He'll be overwhelmed. He's working too hard. Moses was the single judge for the entire nation. And so he says, you got to break it down that, each 10 people, they report to one person, and every one of those report to 10, 100,000, this kind of military this structure. So there's a long story. It goes on for many verses. And then in the book of Deuteronomy, which is still in the Torah, the story is retold. This time Moses, in Moses' first person. And he tells a story about his reformation of the judicial system as if it was his own idea. Jethro's not in the story at all. And so one could easily say, whoa. Moses, shouldn't you give credit to the person who gave you that idea? But of course, the author of the book of Deuteronomy wants to say, Moses got the idea from some non-Jewish Gentile priest? Are you crazy? No, Moses thought of it. The others, they got the story wrong. That's just kind of an example that pops to my mind right away. Different stories, so that's a good example of inner biblical midrash. And all the more so throughout rabbinic literature, Diane, and the pre-rabbinic literature, as Josephus is really kind of that reflects that, but the literature of the last centuries before the Common Era, there's an ongoing tendency to retell stories. We all do it. Every culture around the world does it. They just have a different understanding of view of, I guess, artistic or poetic license. In other words, you can definitely change the story to fit your needs. And all of Midrash is filled with those kinds of things.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
I have something that I'd like to say about King David. When I was in the yeshiva, this came up today, and every time it comes up, it reminds me of one particular learning session about King David in the yeshiva. And this rabbi was telling us, one excuse after another as to why King David is the most revered king in the history of the world. And just excuse after excuse after excuse, giving him reasons why he's still the best king in the world. And every time King David is mentioned, it reminds me of this thing, and it sometimes just gets more than I can bear.
Okay, so what the phenomena you're describing from your Orthodox, the rabbi who taught you when you were a kid, is called apologetics. That's what we call it. Making excuses for. And your rabbi was being true to the Talmudic tradition. I think it's in Tractate of Shabbat. There's a long section of a number of pages that go through different biblical stories that are really embarrassing. And the Hebrew is Misha Omer, but it's something like whoever thinks that King David sinned is none other than mistaken, or surely mistaken. It's like a negative there. And and it gives, for instance, it goes through the Bathsheba story, and it gives a different explanation for every single stage of what happened. For instance, oh, no, he didn't sleep with a married woman. She was already divorced. Of course, the Bible doesn't say she was divorced, but rabbinic tradition is that all of King David's soldiers, before they went out into the field, they sent divorce papers to their wives, a get to their wives, so that if in fact they were lost in battle and nobody would find their body, then the women wouldn't be suspended as what we call, or lankered as what we call today agunot. They'd be able to remarry. I mean, kind of twisted kind of things. Or Uriah, he deserved to die because he didn't fulfill the king's commandment. His king commandment said, "Come to my table and eat with me." But Uriah said, "How can I come and eat with you when my brothers are out on the field dying on the battlefield? I should be with them." And so, in a twisted way, the Talmud says, "Oh, he didn't abide by the king's commandment. He deserved to die." Right. So if you want to justify something, you can always kind of twist it around, and that's the negative side. I think that's the dark side of midrash. On the other hand, it as I said, read, reread, interpret, reinterpret. It's an ongoing methodology. And while one needs to be careful that one doesn't create an absolute chaotic picture, there are, I would say, from my point of view, it's best if we always strive to find out the simple meaning of the text, the pshat, and then we go on to see how it has been drashed, how it has been interpreted by sometimes exegesis, which is taking something out of the text, but more often than not, eisegesis, by putting another message into the text that it's not necessarily found there. Okay.
His credit, he did keep the country together. The country prospered at that time, and he won a lot of battles. He killed a lot of Philistines, and
Go Team David. Okay, I got you. We got you. All right then. A housekeeping issue. There's a young Jewish man who will be doing an internship, unpaid internship this summer in the city of Palm Springs in the planning department. He's a graduate student at USC, and so he's been vetted, but he's looking for a place to stay, I think Monday and Tuesday nights between the end of May or maybe beginning of June and mid-August. If you are interested in renting out a room or giving him a place to stay, if you have a casita or something like that in Palm Springs area, please let me know, and we'll try to hook this guy up so we can help out in that way. Okay. Otherwise, as far as this class is concerned, I think we're going to continue at the 11 o'clock hour, certainly for the near future, and mostly so we can enable our European friends to participate. And
Thank you.
And while I'm away in Israel in July for a week or two, I'll be able to teach from there as well. Okay?
Okay.
All right, everyone.
Right.
Be well. Sei gesund. Good to see you.
See you
Thank you.
tomorrow.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good to see you, Sasha.
Hi, Sasha.
Oh.